Hello, I'm Michelle Glaze, Director of Professional Outreach for the Foundation Fighting Blindness, global leader in driving retinal degenerative disease research. On March 20th, 2024, Dr. Rachel Huckfeldt and Dr. Rochelle Lynn delivered a robust presentation on the best clinical practices for patients with an inherited retinal disease. Following is an excerpt from that webinar. A broad array of therapeutic modalities are currently being evaluated for patients with an inherited retinal disease. During this episode of A Path Forward for IRD and dry AMD patients, Dr. Rachel Huckfeldt will review the clinical trial landscape as well as patient involvement in the clinical trial process.
I'm excited to introduce Dr. Rachel Huckfeldt, MD, PhD. Dr. Huckfeldt is Assistant Professor of Ophthalmology at Harvard Medical Center. She is also a clinician and scientist at Massachusetts Eye and Ear. Dr. Huckfeldt completed her MD and PhD training at Washington University in St. Louis. Her PhD is in research and retinal development. Thank you.
Thank you. I have the privilege of spending a lot of my time thinking about and working on clinical trials. And even though these are investigational therapies, we don't know if they work. That's why we need clinical trials to test them. I just want to stress that they are based on years and sometimes decades of really careful, step-by-step, rigorous science. And they are clearly a major source of hope for IRD patients, even if there's not a trial at that moment that someone can participate in. I could spend an hour talking about the types of therapies currently under development, but just to give you a tip of the iceberg sense of what is underway, we have multiple trials ongoing right now of neuroprotective agents that, whether they're delivered orally, genetically, or by stem cells, the hypothesis is that they can protect the health of the retina and slow down the degeneration. We have gene-specific treatments that ask some of the same questions. Can we slow down the rate of change or maybe even improve it? I'll get to that more in a second. And then we think about vision restoration approaches. Can we use stem cells, retinal chips, or optogenetics to improve vision in areas of the retina where there aren't enough photoreceptors or retinal pigment epithelium to target with a genetic therapy? When we think about genetic therapies, we have different targets and we have different approaches. So gene replacement or augmentation, the Luxturna type of drug, works at a DNA level by introducing a new copy of the gene. Genome editing, which you may hear referred to as CRISPR-Cas, also works at a DNA level, but by editing the actual chromosomal DNA that someone was born with. And both of these therapies are largely delivered by subretinal injection during a vitrectomy. If you think about the central dogma, right, DNA to RNA to protein, that gives us other opportunities to intervene. And so antisense oligos are an intravitreal therapy that can be used to target RNA. And there have been multiple trials to date of that type of approach for IRDs. And then just like we have genome editing, we will see RNA editing coming to the clinic as a therapy in the near future. All of these investigational therapies are tested in a very carefully controlled and regimented series of phases of clinical research that, again, always start after there's been very careful work in the lab and in animal models to make these therapies as safe as possible, assess their safety, and, of course, make sure that they're efficacious in laboratory models before moving to people. Traditionally, in clinical trials, we think about a first phase looking only at safety using normal volunteers before moving on to phase 2 and phase 3, looking at efficacy in individuals with the condition of interest. The reality for rare diseases like IRDs is that phase 1 and 2 often get lumped together. So the very first in-human efforts to test some of these drugs are being done in people with the condition in question. If you have a patient who is interested in clinical trials, or you wonder, I know my patient has this condition or this mutation, how can you find something that's relevant to them? And I would advise you that clinicaltrials.gov is a good starting point. I pulled up the website, I put in RP as the condition of interest, and I chose to only look for studies that are recruiting or recruiting soon. And before I show you the results of that search, I really want to stress this disclaimer here. Clinicaltrials.gov, that .gov sounds like a really official place that everything is vetted and should be there. But in reality, it does not take much to get a quote unquote trial listed here. So some of these should be read with a grain of caution. And I say that because there are, quote unquote treatments that we know have blinded people. And this is a New England Journal of Medicine report talking about a clinic in Florida where the use of a particular type of so-called stem cell actually blinded 3 individuals with AMD. But to come back to my search with those terms, I found 65 studies. That's a lot. What if I want to restrict my focus to phase 3 studies that are interventional and happening in the US? When I do that, I get 1 phase 3 study. So this is a helpful tool for finding the type of study that is most of interest to a specific patient. I also want to thank and acknowledge Ben Shaberman because he keeps a really nice active list of trials on the FFB website. So fightingblindness.org, clinical trial pipeline. And one of the reasons I wanted to stress the phases of trials and the type of interventions is because the intersection of those two things really impacts the amount of risk that a participant encounters. If we have a phase 1-2 trial, so a first in human treatment, and if it's something like a virus-based gene therapy that's being delivered subretinally, there's non-trivial risk. At this point, we don't have any human safety or efficacy data. We know that there is just inherent risk with any type of vitrectomy surgery. We add to that the specific risks of the subretinal injection and the virus itself. And those are things that a potential participant has to consider carefully. In contrast, by the time we get to a phase 3 trial, we've been through phase 1 and 2. We have a sense of what the risks are. We know how to hopefully ameliorate them. And in the case of, the one trial that my clinicaltrials.gov search landed on, this is of an oral medication that's already FDA approved for a different indication that gives us a sense of safety. And there's also good short-term safety data from the earlier studies in RP. So different stages, different risks, but I also want to stress that there is no guarantee of benefit at any of these stages of a clinical trial. All clinical trials really put a heavy time burden on their participants, and these vary a little bit as well across stages. So any phase 1-2 trial involving a surgery means that I will be seeing a participant anywhere from 12 to 16 times in their first year of treatment. Genetic treatments or therapies or trials, those patients are followed for 5 years after treatment. And although the visit frequency falls to every 6 to 12 months, there's a long list of assessments being performed at every visit so we can best understand any efficacy and risks associated with the treatment. By the time a therapy gets to phase 3, we have a better sense of safety. We have a better sense of what outcome measures we're looking at that can together result in maybe fewer visits and hopefully a more tailored list of assessments. But I hope what I've sort of painted for you is that clinical trials ask a lot with no guarantees for the people who participate in them. And it is such an individual decision for an eligible person whether a trial makes sense for them. And there's, no wrong or right answer. It's just highly individual. And we're mostly just happy to have these opportunities to talk to people about. There are other ways to participate in research. I want to highlight the Foundation Fighting Blindness Clinical Consortium. The consortium is comprised of over 40 sites, now in 16 countries on multiple continents. And our goal is really to do foundational research that will accelerate the development of treatments for IRDs. We have completed one natural history study for which the data has already been influential and impactful. We have others underway. And we have a study that is currently recruiting. It's called UniRare for short. We're going to get the clinicaltrials.gov link in the chat. But in brief, this is a study that's open to individuals with IRDs caused by more than 200 genes. It will eventually enroll 1,500 people. For most of those people, participation will involve only a one-time clinic visit that can coincide with when they're seeing their clinician already. For a subset of patients, there will be natural history studies. But this is, another way that motivated patients really can, in a meaningful way, help support research efforts for their diseases.
The Best Clinical Practices for Patients with Inherited Retinal Diseases webinar provides a holistic approach to the care and management of patients with an IRD. To view the webinar in its entirety, or for additional resources for your patients with a retinal degenerative disease, please visit www.fightingblindness.org. You can link to our professional outreach page by clicking on the Eye Care Professionals tab in the top right-hand corner. Thank you for your time and attention. This is Michelle Glaze, Director of Professional Outreach for the Foundation Fighting Blindness.